Today we will be finishing reading and studying the fourth book of the Bible, Numbers. So hooray, hooray, hooray. Time flies by, but we are progressing. And today the three chapters to study is the book of Numbers, chapter 34, 35, and 36. The title for my sermon is God's Story, Cities of Refuge. Cities of Refuge. Before we start reading the biblical material, it's wise to situate ourselves in the history of one specific issue. Let me quote to you a short paragraph from one book which is called Primitive Law. It's by a researcher named Kovalevsky. He writes, belonging to a tribe or family imposed certain obligations on the individual and at the same time gives him certain rights. Offenses directed against one of the namesakes, one of the representatives of your tribe or family, are considered an insult to the entire family or tribe and are a pretext for blood revenge by any of its members. Societies of old, ancient people, almost everywhere lived by a code that became known as blood feud, blood revenge. The essence is very simple. If someone from that tribe injured or mistreated somehow someone from my tribe, it was considered an obligation of any member and all members of my tribe to retaliate, to bring punishment, to bring justice. To whom? To any member of the offender's tribe or family or nation. So it was not proportionate. Ancient people felt a duty. If one of my people was mistreated, then I am obligated to do something and to avenge by causing harm to any representative of the offender's family or tribe. That's the primitive law. That's how many nations lived in antiquity. Blood revenge, blood feud is the term used to describe this reality. So against such a backdrop of historical background, let's read some biblical passages today. The book of Numbers, chapter 35, verses 9 through 12. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, then you shall select cities to be cities of refuge for you, that the manslayer who kills any person without intent may flee there. The cities shall be for you a refuge from the avenger, that the manslayer may not die until he stands before the congregation for judgment." The first obvious truth revealed here is that there was a protection from the blood feud. There was a protection against blood what's the term? Vengeance, right? There were series of refuge to protect a person from any avenger who might be interested in killing the person. Second, what was the way to treat the situation? What was supposed to happen if there was a manslaughter? What do you see in the text? The issue had to be resolved through, do you see the key word there? The last word of the judgment. It was not, one of us got hurt, let's repay, let's avenge. No. Until he stands before the congregation for judgment. So, the issue had to be resolved in court. When you continue reading this chapter, Numbers 35:30 says the following: if anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death on the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. So there was a process to follow. Witnesses, eyewitnesses, were to be summoned to clarify what exactly took place. In the parallel text, in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verse 6, we read, on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. So the issue had to be studied. The issue had to be brought to appropriate figures. Eyewitnesses had to be questioned. And the whole matter should be dealt with special care. This is very different from what we find in the nations of old that lived right alongside with Israelites. Going on, we find verse 15. The book of Numbers, chapter 35, verse 15 says, these 6 cities shall be for refuge for the people of Israel, and for the stranger, and for the sojourner among them, that anyone who kills any person without intent may flee there. What do we find? Whether you are a citizen, whether you are a stranger, or the one who temporarily dwells in the country, everyone had equal protection under the law. You might remember that once during his missionary journeys, Apostle Paul was about to be whipped. And when he was stretched, attached to this special, execution machine, and when they were ready to give him some lashes, right? He asked, "Is it permitted for you to whip a Roman citizen without the proper judgment?" And when the captain heard that, he became scared because he was about to commit a lawless act. And he says, "Are you really a Roman citizen?" And Paul says, "Yes." And then the captain replies, "I bought this citizenship for a big sum of money." And Apostle Paul says, I was born into it. What does this incident illustrate? This is Rome. First century AD. The rights of different dwellers of the Roman Empire were not equal at all. There were citizens and non-citizens, and slaves, and so forth. Citizens did have protection. And when you compare it with the biblical ideal, it says, for the people of Israel, again, verse 15, Numbers 35:15, for the stranger and for the sojourner among them. So, equal rights, regardless of origin and immigration or citizenship status. This is something that no other culture had. There have always been segregation between different classes of society, but not in the Bible. Going further, we discover verses 22 through 25. Same chapter, the book of Numbers, chapter 35, verses 22 through 25. But if he pushed him suddenly without enmity, or hurled anything on him without lying in wait, or used a stone that could cause death, and without seeing him dropped it on him so that he died, though he was not his enemy and did not seek his harm, then the congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood in accordance with these rules, and the congregation shall rescue the manslayer from the hand of the avenger of blood, and the congregation shall restore him to his city of refuge to which he had fled, and he shall live in it until the death of the high priest who was anointed with the holy oil. Another very important concept is a difference between intentional and unintentional killing. The question was asked, was it willful? Was it on purpose? Did he want to harm the person and kill the person? Was he waiting on the top of the construction building with a huge stone in his hands to release it at the appropriate time to hit a person walking below? Or did it really happen as an accident? This was to be studied. A very important concept of a difference between intentional and unintentional crime. But how do you know? If there were eyewitnesses, if people knew that this person had ill will and did want to kill that one, then it helps. But what if there were no witnesses? How would you know if there was an intention or not? It just slipped out of my hands, right? At the right time to hit it right here, right? How would you know? The text gives us the following answer. The high priest. There is this figure that appears in the text, the high priest. You could see it in the last sentence of the high priest who was anointed with the holy oil. So then the question is, what did the high priest have that would help to determine the truth? Let's go to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 17, again, verses 8 and 9 at this time. If any case arises requiring decision between one kind of homicide and another, one kind of legal right and another, or one kind of assault and another. Any case within your towns that is too difficult for you, then you shall arise and go up to the place that the Lord your God will choose, and you shall come to the Levitical priests and to the judge who is in the office in those days, and you shall consult them, and they shall declare to you the decision. So if the local court that was typically gathering at the gates of a town, right, was not in agreement, if there were differences of opinions, then you would go to the place which the Lord will choose. You will go to the priest. Question: how would the priest know? At least these local judges, they would know, the family or families, the dynamics, some history. But if you go to the center, how would a priest help? Here's the answer. The book of Exodus chapter 28, verse 30 says, Exodus 28:30, and in the breastpiece of judgment you shall put the Urim and the Thummim, and they shall be on Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. Thus Aaron shall bear the judgment of the people of Israel on his heart before the Lord regularly. What did the high priest have? It's called the breastpiece of judgment. So one part of the garments of the high priest was created in such a way that it had the thing called Urim and Thummim. And what it did, it gave judgment. Twice we have the word judgment here. The breastpiece of judgment, and then it says, he shall bear the judgment of the people of Israel on his heart. It was right here. And when we read about how it was used, for example, a question would be asked: shall I go and do this? And based on the way the stones lit with light, the high priest was able to know the answer. So in essence, what would happen if there are no witnesses, or if it's a mistrial? The people would present the case to the Lord and would ask a question: was this a willful act or not? Was this an intentional or unintentional homicide? And the Lord will judge. The judgment would take place in the presence of the Lord, and the high priest would know by looking at this breastpiece what is the decision. So, when sanctuary was still standing, and when there was Levitical priesthood, the high priest had this privilege. One of his roles was to be the ultimate high court of the land. How do we call it in this country? The Supreme Court of the land. And only one person was there. So mistrial was not an option. And it was the ultimate decision, because God knows what really took place. He knows the intention of the heart. That was the setup. Now, the next question is this. We read that this person would live in the city of Refuge when it was determined that he was not an enemy to the one who was killed, right? He would live in the city of Refuge till when? Till the death of the high priest. till the death of the person who, by using the Urim and Thummim, determined that he is not guilty of willful act of taking someone's life. And this poses a question: why was it this way? Why that person who was a manslayer, why was he to live in the city of refuge till the death of the high priest? And after that death, he could relocate back to where he used to live, and no one would touch him. Let's take a look at the book of Exodus, chapter 28, the same one that we just read, verses 36 through 38. It says, "You shall make a plate of pure gold and engrave on it, like the engraving of a signet, holy to the Lord. And you shall fasten it on the turban by a cord of blue. It shall be on the front of the turban. It shall be on Aaron's forehead, and Aaron shall bear any guilt from the holy things that the people of Israel consecrate as their holy gifts. It shall regularly be on his forehead, that he may be accepted before the Lord." So, one of the functions of the high priest was to do what? He shall bear any guilt. And this guilt was associated with the things that people of Israel would give to the Lord, or offer to the Lord, or sacrifice to the Lord. So here's the question: what was the sacrifice prescribed for unintentional manslaughter? There are different sacrifices prescribed for different things. Do you remember what was the offering required for this unintentional killing? The answer is that no such offering existed. But the person is gone. You killed the person. Yes, you did not mean to, but still, it's a tragedy. You know, the person was a father who fed the family, or she was a wife, or a mother. I mean, there is this profound, significant loss to the immediate family, to the community. And knowing that you caused this death, whether you wanted it or not, it is still, it's still an issue. It's still an enormous burden to carry. So, because there was no sacrifice that could alleviate this burden, the burden was placed on whom? The high priest. Aaron shall bear any guilt. So the reason why this person had to live in the city of refuge till the death of the high priest was that the high priest was carrying this guilt, carrying this burden. And then when the high priest would die, the process and the guilt was erased. That's the connection. That's the connection between the high priest and his burden. When the high priest died, he took this matter with him to the grave. Lastly, the book of Numbers, chapter 35, verses 31 through 34 says, "Moreover, you shall accept no ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall be put to death. And you shall accept no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the high priest. You shall not pollute the land in which you live, for blood pollutes the land. And no atonement can be made for the land, for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of the one who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell in the midst of the people of Israel. Very important piece of legislation in this context. It was impossible to buy yourself out to avoid justice. If it was determined that it was a malicious act and the person did want to kill, then it was impossible to bribe, to pay money, and have a deal reached to avoid the penalty. The rich had no advantage over the poor. Unfortunately, in many cultures, even today, in those societies that pride themselves in being just, it oftentimes happens that the rich can escape justice, even in unofficial ways, by being able to afford rich, expensive lawyers, for example, right? That was not the case with God. So it was impossible to buy yourself out to avoid justice. Because, as we just read, if the blood was shed maliciously, then the only way to avenge it was for the blood of the murderer to be shed. In the book of Genesis, chapter 9, verses 5 and 6, we read, "And for your life blood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from every man. From his fellow men I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image." Exodus 21:14, "But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar that he may die." So today we are studying the laws about cities of refuge. My sermon is titled God's Story, Cities of Refuge. The last question for today is this: is this law in effect today? Shall we have those cities of refuge in our county or state or country? Here's what the Bible says. We read these two verses at the very beginning, the book of Numbers, chapter 35, verses 9 and 10. "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into the land of Canaan, this is what you shall do." So what do you see? What do you hear? Initially, this law had limited use. It was given for the land, for the promised land. It was given for the state of Israel. That was the system that was designed for a theocratic society, which Israel was and was represented by. Now, second factor that would help us to determine whether this law should be enacted today or not is the figure of the high priest. So the priesthood has to exist for this structure and this system to be used. There was one moment in the history of the people of God when they came back from the Babylonian captivity and they were rebuilding their life and so forth. Here's what happened. The book of Ezra, chapter 2, verses 59 through 63. The following were those who came up from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Adan, and Immer, though they could not prove their fathers' houses or their descent, whether they belonged to Israel. So documents were lost. They could not prove their genealogy. Now, it says further, verse 61, also, of the sons of the priests, and then names are given, verse 62, these sought their registration among those enrolled in the genealogies, but they were not found there, and so they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. The governor told them that they were not to partake of the most holy food until there should be a priest to consult, Urim and Thummim. So when there are no documents, when there is no evidence, when it is impossible, humanly speaking, to determine what really is the truth here, the high priest was needed. And so until there is a high priest who can be consulted with Urim and Thummim, the case is unsolved. They could not partake of the holy food if it's unknown whether they are of Aaronic lineage, whether they are descendants of Aaron the high priest or not. So, because today there is no high priest on earth in any of the churches who has the Urim and Thummim and is able to get the direct answer from God, this system would not work. We would not know whether it was willful or unwilling, accidentally happening death. So these two factors, first, the locality, it was tied to specific land and specific state of Israel, and the need for the high priest who has the Urim and Thummim help us answer the question. No, today it's not possible to have this kind of system. But what is possible and should be happening is the following. All the principles at work in this system are still valid. And they are, first of all, ban on lynching, on mob rule. One of us got hurt. Let's smash the other side. No, it's not allowed. The vengeance, the revenge one-to-one is not allowed. It should be dealt accordingly in a place of judgment. That's the first principle. No mob rule. Second, it's personal responsibility for the crime. You obviously have heard about the laws of Hammurabi, right? The ancient Sumerian king. And there is this stone stele with his laws that was discovered, and many copies of it were discovered later. It was a significant step beyond the primitive blood feud rule that was dominant. Hammurabi sought to stop the blood revenge. And here's one example of what he came up with. A precedent is given. If there is a builder who built a house, and then, for example, its roof caved in and killed a son of the owner, do you know what was supposed to be the justice according to the laws of Hammurabi? What needed to take place for the justice to occur? The answer is the son of the builder was to be killed. Equal loss, right? A son of the owner was killed. The reason was the builder. Now, the son of the builder was to be put to death. Biblical approach is totally different. Personal responsibility, not by association, not because this is my family. The Bible is very clear. Sons, children should not be punished for their fathers, for their parents' deeds or sins, and vice versa. So personal responsibility for the crime is still valid, is still a principle to be lived by. The third one, equality before the law. Regardless of your citizen status, regardless of origin, regardless of status. If you are a human, you are made in the image of God, you have value, and you should be treated accordingly. Another one, the difference between intentional and unintentional sin. These are all the very important lessons for us to live by today. So that's God's story for today. Amen.